now to our speaker, Theresa. She has written this book. I know her quite some time. She worked in various places, UN agency as well as ICEAS in Singapore, and more recently she's doing various consultancy work and other type of work, and she has written this book, of which I have written a small comment endorsement for this book, because I believe it's a very important topic, often neglected. So what is the role of women and gender pattern in food security? Without further ado, she comes from Singapore, and you will hear from her accent too. And please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, for that introduction. Just before I start, I would like to say a bit about how this book evolved. It came out of a workshop at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, the workshop was held in 2010 or 2011. Anyhow, I left the Institute in 2014. The book has been updated. The information in the book has been updated. I had each of the authors adding information in terms of using updated materials. So this sort of, the information in the book sort of has been brought up to speed, okay, to today. So it's not like, the information is old. But although that is a concern, the fact that the workshop was held some time ago and you might be saying, okay, the data is old, the point is that the ideas and the arguments still stand. So in other words, the problems that women face in terms of food security issues, those problems still continue, and they probably will be persistent coming decades as well, in the context of climate change. So let's bear that in mind as I go through this talk as well, okay? Now what I've done is I've prepared something. Leah has told me try to keep it to 20 minutes, so that after that what we can do is we can discuss these themes that keep popping up in the book, okay? So just lend me your ears for the next 20 minutes. Okay, now as you know, in the last century we've had a population explosion, Now we've hit something like what, 8-9 billion in the world. The concern is that we need to feed more people as the population grows. Since the 1950s, we've had the Green Revolution. Now that brought about some sort of hope. Why? Because food productivity levels went up. So we have high-yielding plants that were introduced, new fertilizers, etc. But then we also know that with the introduction of all these new strains of plants and new technologies, there have been environmental repercussions of that, okay? So it's in that context that we have to remember what is happening in terms of extreme hunger and malnutrition, okay? Now, currently there are more people than the physical capacity of the earth can provide for. In particular, developing countries continue to be mired by hunger and famine, in spite of crop production globally having doubled over the last 50 years. As of 2014, 795 million people are estimated to be chronically undernourished. Worldwide, children form a vulnerable group, with 25% of them suffering from stunted growth. Moreover, nearly 40,000 children die as a result of malnutrition and its accompanying diseases every day. Now, this is not your kids in Yemen as a result of war dying. This is children dying because of having lack of nutritious, the lack of access to nutritious foods. United Nations estimates reveal that 67% of those in need of adequate and nutritious food all year around come from Asia. Now, Goal 2 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals aims to end hunger and malnutrition by 2030. The United Nations is concerned with the right to food, or access to food as a right by each and every person. How this might be achieved is that all barriers to food accessibility must be removed. Although this concept is understood as a moral obligation for all governments, yet it has been legally not implemented in most states today. There continue to be millions who are unable to access food, and the reasons are twofold. There could be no food available on the one hand, but if food is available, it cannot be accessed by those who need it most. Now, in our quest to achieve food security for all, should women's role be considered a key dimension, right? So where are women in all of this? Now, we all know it's a near universal that social and cultural norms posit women as the gatekeepers of food in the family, a role bound up with their place as primary caregiver, which is a good thing because it has positive effects on safeguarding the well-being of members of the family, in particular children. For that reason, women are more likely to report food insecurity compared with men. But women's role in food security should not be confined to the notion that women belong to the kitchen. Why? Because throughout history, and in fact in much of the developing world, women play an integral role in food production as farmers. Now, although they may be overlooked by policy planners and government officials, now when it comes to census reports, women are never included as farmers, yeah? They're just housewives or, women who are not productive, right? They're not working in a labor force. Now, I'll give you some numbers. Worldwide, about 43% of the agricultural labor force comprises women. In East Asia and Southeast Asia, women account for approximately 50% of food production overall and make up a substantial proportion of the agricultural labor force. I'll give you examples. 35% for Malaysia, 47% for the Philippines, 54% for Indonesia, and in Thailand, 60%. Now, women's responsibilities in agricultural work run a gamut. They produce agricultural crops, they tend to animals, they process and prepare food, they work in agricultural and other rural enterprises, they collect fuel and water, they engage in trade. You find them in the marketplace selling vegetables, selling rice, what have you, and they also end up caring for family members, right? And that's also part of their involvement in food production. Now, despite playing a central role in food production, instead women have often been perceived as workers, primarily because they're not perceived as workers, primarily because they are unpaid, since farming has always been a family enterprise. Now, in this case, men are usually documented as workers because they are the first point of contact by government officials. Now, what this means is that while access to adequate resources is a problem by both male and female farmers, but for women, their access to food resources becomes complicated further. Why? Because of structural, political, cultural, and social factors. Now, moreover, when agricultural technologies such as new crop varieties, fertilizers, insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides are introduced to a community, often men and not women become the beneficiaries of such knowledge. In the same vein, development planners often assume that men are the storehouses of agricultural knowledge and not female farmers. But there's been work done that has shown that actually women know more than men. Well, sorry about the men in the room here, but I think there are some areas where women do better. Often, development planners are blamed, right? You blame them, you say, oh well, they're the ones, women, they're the ones who they overlook, women, and women become invisible. But what is it that is causing their invisibility? It's their reproductive responsibilities in the home. They're at home most of the time, so they don't attend training programs. When it comes to meetings, they don't go out there. Their husbands go instead because they're at home looking after the children. Now, owing to these misunderstandings of women's role as independent farmers, women's participation in agricultural production by and large has been limited to small-scale informal farming. Among these women are the poor and landless, who are also highly dependent on others for work, especially the wealthier farmers. So these women go and they sell their labor, okay, to the wealthier farmers. These women, unfortunately, are caught in a situation where they are powerless. The people who own or buy their labor are the powerful. And these women would never speak about their conditions because they're always fearful of antagonizing the very individuals who hire them. Now, particularly among poor women farmers, the green revolution technologies have posed as an obstacle to their household survival. As these technologies, as well as new crop varieties, are expensive, women from households with small plots of land are not able to afford these new technologies. Now, because the production of crops such as rice is labor intensive, these women also face difficulties in accessing the new varieties. Well, they don't have money. What happens is they're not able to raise their own yields, right? The yields of their own crops, and as a result, they stay poor forever. Now, these are some of the themes that pop up in my book, okay, this edited volume. Women and ensuring a square meal, women and food security in Southeast Asia. It's a compendium of 10 chapters. The book seeks to uncover the various dimensions and processes related to women's role in food security in the family, women's role in agriculture and food production, and state constructions of women's role in food production in the family and in the community. Successfully reversing the taken for granted focus on food security studies, which almost always deals with state interventions. Now, this book is different. What it does is it takes into account the consumer or the women themselves. They're consuming, they're producing food. This book does that. Okay, so it gives a different perspective to the story of food security. Now, focus mainly on peasant families and communities. The chapters examine a range of dimensions linked to women and food security, one of which is how women's role in food security has played out at the family, household, farm, state, and regional levels, and how this role has evolved in the last decades. Now, at the household level, achieving food security needs entail improving the validity of scales and clarity of concepts. After the first chapter, which is the chapter which I wrote, the second chapter, written by two economists, Richard Baricello and Rupananda Widananga, assert that incorporating the gender perspective in food security has proven to be problematic because economic analysis related to food security requires data on total income, food consumption, and food production by gender, and usually this data is very difficult to come by. Now, we always think, well, women are connected to food, right? And that's a common assumption. Now, interestingly enough, this idea persists even when women have migrated to another part of the world. In my chapter, in my study of Indonesian domestic helpers in Singapore, I found that the women domestic workers I interviewed, they were still thinking about what was going on the table of their families back home. And in fact, in spite of coming away from agriculture and saying, oh, I don't want to, tend to the fields, it's hard work, it's so hot, it's that and other, these women are actually sending money home through their remittances, and part of their remittances are actually used towards keeping their farms, the family farms going. Now, there's always the government too, and governments are often blamed. Now, there are two sides to it, and there are two chapters that actually look at governments. The first chapter is the Indonesian government. The Indonesian government is cognizant of the fact that there are women who are left behind in terms of being more hungry or suffering from or facing hunger more than other households. There is a program that the government has put out, and which is called the Raskin program, Rice for Poor Households program. And it's a great program because women receive extra savings and they can defray food costs, etc. But ironically, two people, the two authors, Akapon Chongvilaivan and Tanu Tripta Savit, have actually found that women have dropped out. And they've dropped out of the program citing three reasons: lack of liquidity, quality concerns, and inadequate rice quantity. Now, and they say the problem with the program is that the government executes a program and it doesn't quite listen to the voices of these women. So what is necessary is that the women's needs should be taken into account, right? We always think that we know, government officials think that they know that when they put out a program, they know what women need. But it's better to ask them, but unfortunately, they say that that voice has not been taken into account. Now, while we know of governments who act in this way, well, quite arrogantly, you've got also governments who act within a very developmentalist attitude, very greedy. There's another chapter by Lipo On who looks at the expansion of the oil palm industry in Sarawak. Now, as you know, in Sarawak, you've got indigenous people, and some of them are itinerant, like the Penan people. What this oil palm industry has done, or the expansion of these industries, is actually swallowed and taken away, robbed these people of their indigenous native lands, and the women actually have lost their food resources. Okay, so his chapter talks about that, or rather the traditional food sources. Now, what happens as a result also is that they don't only lose these traditional food sources, but also these indigenous notions, indigenous knowledge of their environment as a result of their land being taken away from them. Now, this whole notion of women's voices not being taken into account, women being invisible, keeps popping up again and again. There's another program in Indonesia where it's a program directed or targeted at women farmers. Same thing happens. Titik Sumarti found that women's double workload is overlooked, and as a result, the program is not as efficient or effective as it is if only women were taken into account. So she makes an argument that these programs need to be gender sensitive in order to reach out to women. And as a result, and also that gender discriminatory practices within the program can be removed. A similar thing popped up in another chapter, this time on southern Vietnam, by two people, Chong Thi Ngoc Chi and Thelma Paris. They say that women's exclusion from rice varietal development can be attributed to agricultural development practitioners associating women with the private sphere as caregivers rather than as workers, in spite of their providing labor in most rice operations, including production, post-harvest, and marketing, aside from their participation in non-rice crop livestock and non-farm activities. Now, they also talk about poor farmers and female-headed farmers. And they say, as a result of the attitude of these government planners and these programs, and the fact that these programs are not gender sensitive, what this does is that the women, especially poor farmers, female-headed farmers, they end up borrowing money from money lenders in order to put food on the table. Sarah Turner and Christine Bonnet found the same thing as well, and this time with indigenous people groups, the Hmong and the Yao families in Vietnam's northern uplands. Okay, let me just fast forward here. Now, there's another chapter which is quite different, which also has a heavy sort of female dimension to it. It's a chapter by Feng Nguyen and her authors, also on Vietnam. In fact, they found that women who were empowered were more likely to have food-secure families, and their children were less likely to suffer from stunting. Now, what do they mean by women's empowerment? This is how they defined it. They control the finances of the household, they have food purchasing power, they have greater movement or greater mobility, they have authority over child minding, okay? And it's not their mothers-in-law. Now, this is patriarchal patrilineal, right? A woman marries into her husband's household. They've got peer support and ownership of his assets, including jewelry. Now, this is a woman who's empowered. and she controls the jewelry. Now, in fact, to empower women means that poverty should not drive individuals engaged in farming to seek other forms of income generation jobs. The chapter on the Philippines addresses this very point, as migration was seen to be the poverty elevation solution peasants have been found to adopt. In the chapter, in fact the last chapter by Jorge Tino, migration, he says, is always painted in a positive light. Well, Philippines is the largest labor exporter in the world, yeah? But he says migration actually is a two-edged sword. Why does he say this? While remittances from women migrants are likely to lead to higher investments in non-land assets like education and health among left-behind family members, the lack of investment in agricultural lands and agriculturally based activities have actually had a negative impact on agricultural productivity and in turn exacerbated food insecurity over the long term. Why? Because it is people from the farming community who are migrating. And when they migrate, there are fewer farmers left behind. So what this means is that puts a stress on food supply. And by the way, Philippines is now a food importing country. Used to be self-sufficient, it's now importing. So that's not smart at all. Now, in closing, I want to highlight that throughout the book, poverty turns up as a key factor constraining accessibility to food. But the poor are handicapped in other ways. They are precluded from education and knowledge about nutrition that would help increase food security. Since farming is the principal source of livelihood among the rural poor, including poor women, an underlying assumption is that factors impeding their access to agricultural resources and services and discouraging them from producing food crops have to be addressed if food security needs are to be met by all. Now, having said that, any attempt to understand the interactions between women and food security cannot ignore factors such as poverty, extreme minority status, culture, geographical location, and governmental responses. In fact, poverty and food insecurity continue to be concentrated in the rural areas and among the small peasant sector in Southeast Asia. I'll leave it at that.
I think we can add some comment, reflection from those in the family.
Questions? Yes. Hi, my name is Pauline Ostrov. I'm from the Institute of Development Studies and we love work on gender and health and rights. My question to you is about migration. I think you're spot on when you talk about the rural areas, you know, as areas of migration with a lot of the men leaving. Although the pattern is quite different, of course, in different places, but in general, it's a lot of men leaving and a lot of women left behind. Now, in terms of increasing food productivity and land ownership of these women, where should we go? Should we go and intensify the production of these small landholders? Should we merge? Like, what would be the way forward in terms of, you know, increasing food productivity and not having women actually empowering?
Right.
Any other comments or questions? No, so first. Okay. Oh, sure.
Thank you for introducing the group. I'm Chiaki from Ireland, National Organization for Migration.
Yes, hello, yes.
So my question is related to empowerment of the woman you mentioned. If you understand a little more details about like 5 pillars in vision?
Okay, sure. Okay.
And I also I was interested in also if any of the authors talks about the education or literacy level about these women in the rural area.
Okay. Yeah, okay, yes. Okay. Thank you for those two very good questions. Okay, as we all know, in Southeast Asia, farming is a family-based activity. What happens is from one generation to another, that plot of land gets smaller and smaller. Right? Yeah. So now you've got very small plots of land. So how do you ensure that the productivity levels are high enough, or you can get as much as you can, right, out of that small piece of land? The point is to use strains new rice strains or whatever that crop is, new strains that can be that you can get a good crop out of that small piece of land. Now the problem though is that these new strains of rice tend to be more expensive than the regular strains of rice. So that's one problem that these farmers encounter. The other thing is if the farmer tends to be poorer, the person is more likely not going to be able to afford that new strain of rice, where that person can get a higher yield in return. So that's where the problem lies. Okay? Selling land, I've spoken to a lot of Indonesian women. They would never see selling land as a solution to the problem that they have as farmers. Rather, they'd rather just migrate, earn an income abroad, and what they're looking for is a regular income. Now, in many parts of Indonesia, you've got 3 crops. You've got 3 crops in Thailand, 3 crops in Burma, most parts of Burma. Cambodia, you've got sometimes 2 crops, you've got 1 crop. Vietnam, depending on where you are. In spite of that, and not having, you're not talking about, having a locust, destroying a crop, or you have a typhoon coming through. Women, if you talk to migrant women, they all want to migrate, and they will all tell you one thing: I get a regular income, and that's what they're looking for. You don't get a regular income with farming. Yeah. So I don't know what the solution is. I've got to be honest with you. They do not know what the solution is. Governments have also stepped in, but women have told me that usually there's so much corruption, so they don't get the help that they need. Let's say if there's a crop that they've lost. So, and in this part of the world, you don't have mechanization, right? Farming is basically just a home activity. It's a family activity. It's only the landless that go sell their labor to a larger farmer who owns a larger plot, a bigger farmer or a big farmer who has a large piece of land. Okay, so I don't know if that answers your question. So I really don't know what the solution is. But what makes the picture so complex is you've got middlemen, and then you've got corporations involved, and it's a complete, like what we talked about just now, James and I talked about. So it's a complete mess where you've got farmers just getting poorer and poorer. So you've got people who just want to come out of farming. And this can't go on, because that means that food productivity levels in this world could go down, and with climate change, they might actually go down further, which is kind of scary. Okay, your question on this, yeah, okay. In that chapter on women's empowerment, they defined women's empowerment according to those 5 pillars. I mentioned them. They used those pillars because they had done work, and that the authors had done work on the ground, and they asked these women what those pillars were, like what those measures of measurement of empowerment are, and then they used that, and they collected data, and they used regression to come up with the analysis. Yeah. Education, yeah, education and literacy. I'm not mistaken, that popped up in the data as well. Yeah, but there's a chapter actually that talks about children more explicitly. The other chapters sort of, children were not sort of, you know, analyzed in, you know, taken into account as explicitly as that particular chapter. All the other chapters looked at women more generally. Hope that answers your question. Yes.
Other comments, reflection on what has been said?
Or anything comparative from, you know, your country. Indonesia, for example. Yeah. And Thailand too. Thailand is brilliant. I mean, it's still food sufficient.
Any comments from Indonesia or Thailand from your own experience? Thai? Indonesia? What is your experience with women farmers?
Maybe I have a question.
Yeah, sure, yes.
Discussion about it. So I had a research about how to educate the women about food safety in rural areas in Indonesia. So I'm just wondering, like, about the educations to the women in this book. What type of educations and how do you educate them, like in terms of what they do? Is it like through discussion normally or like?
You mean the? Okay, this is a collection of chapters. Yeah. So when you mean women, the women who were analyzed in each of these chapters, were they educated? What do you mean? I don't understand.
How would you educate women about food safety? And
Oh, how would you educate women about food safety? Oh, okay.
food security or
Food security. Oh, that's a good point. How would you educate women? Never thought about that though. Yeah. Doesn't pop up in the book, which is actually very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, food safety is another issue altogether.
what was the result of your study?
So I was conducting a research about how to educate the women in 3 ways: through through games, through discussion, or just through like a basic presentations. So my research shows that through discussion, like focus group discussions, give a lot of impact to their knowledge, behavior, and attitudes compared to games and just basic presentation about food safety.
I think when we talk about food insecurity, we're concerned about accessibility to adequate amounts of food and nutritious foods. Yeah, so that's quite different from the question you're asking, which is about safety. Yeah.
This is more about the methodology for educational purposes. So it's more what methodology is effective and which one is not effective. Any other experience that can be shared? No?
We can
Nothing
talk
about the conglomerates?
Yeah, we can talk about food security as a whole without the women dimension to it. Yeah,
Important
if
point
anyone.
is to put the women dimension into it.
Yes, but we can talk about other dimensions to it without the woman dimension to it. Yeah.
Actually, I am interested how to change the perception. If indeed we agree that the woman dimension has not been taken into account, what needs to be done to ensure that more people are interested in this issue,
Right.
more thinking goes, we get finally segregated data and all the rest.
Yes,
So what
yes.
do you think could be a strategy or what kind of strategy can be pursued?
I think
to change this
governments need to collect
perception?
data, and I think that isn't that data available.
So
And if there is data, the data is very skewed. The data is collected through the lens of governments, policymakers, rather than getting women to speak up, taking the woman's voice into perspective. So it may not be data that would be useful. So it takes a whole change in mindset of, of governance?
So any experience
I
with...
think it goes back to the
think
whole...
we have tried to get segregated data for centuries.
The
We have
problem...
not been able to get it. So any brilliant idea of what can be tried.
The problem is that the man is still seen as the head of the household, rather than the woman being an equal player, and she also, in other words, you've got heads of household rather than the head of the household. There's no such thing as the head of the household. Especially in Southeast Asia, when you think that, you've got bilateral and you've got matrilineal communities in this part of the world. So we're very much unlike China, Japan, Korea. Vietnam is the only exceptional country here, right? It's patrilineal. So according to civil law in Vietnam, men and women are entitled to owning land. But almost always, customary law kicks in, and the land is always held in the man's, in the name of the man. Now, Indonesia is interesting. Civil law states that even when it comes to inheritance, that land is equally distributed between sons and daughters. But apparently, I've read literature where customary law kicks in and the girl gets more than the boy, because you're looking at bilateral and matrilineal communities. So this is an interesting part of the world, very different from South Asia, very different from East Asia.
On land ownership, there in the northeastern India, it's about like 25% of the indigenous population in the world, and it's now very well documented. You have matrilineal communities there. One of them has sea. And what's really interesting there is that originally the youngest daughter would have the duty of care for the parents, and in return for that care, she would get the land, the house. So, wow, this is great. But the public land is owned by men, and the governance structures are all run by men. So, and where is most money to be made? It's in these public land structures. That's where the investment is, that's where the companies are. Meanwhile, these girls who are doing very well in school would like to not be tied to the land with their parents who are getting older and older and are trying to sell the land. So there you see how matrilineality is attacked from several sides, all with the same effect, women getting less access and less control on the land. So, the matrilineal thing isn't so straightforward.
Right, yes, yes. But something, I think colonialism might have messed things up there, because the colonialists came with their mindset and their cultural sort of, cultural notions of heads of, what the head of household is, and that could have been imposed on these people groups. That's what happened in Malaysia amongst the Minangkabau groups like in Negeri Sembilan, and it's been quite well documented that women were losing land and their brothers owned the land, sons owned land, because it was just not right to have land in the name of the women. And the colonialists couldn't make that change in their mindset that traditionally land belongs to women. Women controlled it because they were the ones, it's through the woman line that land was passed through, right? Not the male line.
That's not the case there.
So we blame the colonialists. We blame
Well,
white men for doing that.
Somebody to blame.
Yeah.
What to do
Always
about
someone
it.
to blame,
Yeah.
yes.
Any more?
Could I ask something?
Yes,
Hi.
please.
You
Wait.
mentioned about the empowered woman.
Thank you.
You mentioned about the empowered woman,
Yes.
and that she owns jewelry, she owns property. So what is that link? Could you please explain that again?
They found that when women were empowered, and they defined empowerment in quite some narrow terms, their children suffered from lower levels of stunting. So in other words, when women were disempowered, conversely, women were disempowered, in other words, they didn't have control over childminding, they had to listen to their mothers-in-law. In fact, the chapter documents that. They didn't own jewelry, etc. Their children were more likely going to suffer from higher levels of stunting. Okay, there's been a lot of literature, in fact it's pretty rich, that when women have an education, they go out, they work, they're more likely to have healthier children, they are more likely to be healthier as well. Their children are more likely to be vaccinated, for example. They're more likely to take the money they earn and buy better foods. Men do not channel their income to the children. They go and purchase other things. And if there's extra money, they go and smoke and they go and drink. But in Southeast Asia, what's interesting is, like in Indonesia, Malaysia, the woman is the one who controls the money. I think in Thailand and Cambodia, men pass the money on to the woman, she controls it. She will give him pocket money to smoke and to drink. Okay, then you see them out in the coffee shops drinking and smoking, but it's that money that she controls and she just gives him a tiny bit of their income while he works. Completely different in South Asia and East Asia. Yeah?
Thank you.
To the authors of that chapter where they mentioned the empowerment, do they have any suggestions for how to educate the men in those communities to make them aware of the benefits of empowerment and to try to change that culture? Do they have any thoughts on how to do that?
Unfortunately not. Academics tend not to do that. They tend not to be prescriptive. They tend to be analytical. Yeah? They ask questions. I mean, this is the academic exercise. They're interested in a topic. They see a gap in the literature. They ask a question. That question, they go out. They come up with a hypothesis. They go out. They conduct a study. They come up with results. And then they write a chapter. Bingo, you got it. But they won't go out there and say, let's try to solve this. What is the solution to this? Which is quite sad because academics are living in some ivory tower. A lot of them are. A lot. Yeah. So that's when the UN and all these other organizations have to step in, right? Because they're action-oriented. So there's a place for everyone in this world.
But I think there are many men involvement programs which try to change not only the field of agriculture but other. Now there are discussions about how effective these programs are without changing the general structural context of it, which reproduce some of this role. And there are debates whether this is the way to go, or first you have to improve power women first, then, because if you start to shift resources away to make program about men and then forget about the part of having women take control first, because I think one important part is that in the discussion that you ask is the fact that women, if have more autonomy, more this, then they can make decision of their own. I mean, the key is in the control of their sex and decision making, which come with the control of the access, and that results in positive outcome. Okay, Marley.
I like that point you made about data. I like that because I do agree with you that data plays a huge role in that, and data is usually in the hands of policymakers and therefore government institutions. One way we tried to work around that when I was working in gender research was to work with the Philippines. We have what we call a National Statistical Coordination Board, so they're the ones who collect the information per thematic area: poverty, gender, family planning, farming, etc., agriculture, etc. And they didn't have a gender lens, so there was a lot of work between NGOs and the NSCB to try and advocate and look at data with a gender dimension. And there has been some success, but the support and the partnership has to be consistent. otherwise. 1 year, gender is the flavor of the month. 2-3 years after, it falls on the wayside. That's the thing. So policy advocacy really plays a huge role in that.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for that comment. I don't think I've always seen Philippines as being like a very woman powerful sort of a country. I mean, you look at the data that comes out of the Philippines. You've got the highest number of women who are managers, politicians, and your Global Gender Gap report shows that. And then you're telling me here that, wow, your National Statistical Board doesn't collect gender disaggregated data. Wow. That's kind of like, oh, okay, how did that happen,
It was like a decade ago when I was working in that. But I think that was very important because at that time, looking at data with a gender lens was still a growing effort. And to have something along those lines, that would be very still a challenge.
Segregated data, I think you cannot find in Thailand, right? Many issues. Or Indonesia is still, although it's been a demand for many years, and everybody said we need sex, even on the basic issue, but it seems to be quite, not in isolated projects, but to put it as part of the statistical, collection, that is a big challenge, I think. But we continue insisting for that. But a lot, I think, is more participatory research. But at really national level, still there is a big gap of evidence aggregated in all fields, not only in agriculture, but indeed it's a challenge how to do. So any more reflection and comments? Okay, yes, please.
Hello. Yeah. So going back to the question about coming up with solutions and also involving men in the solutions. When I did some research in Uganda, what we found about some of the programs that try to financially empower women, there were some backlashes because the men in that patriarchal society felt very threatened, and they ended up, leaving the families, just finding another woman. That was the culture there. I mean, the culture could be slightly different, but Uganda, yeah. So it's a different continent, but that's the form of patriarchy that was practiced there. So I think it raises a very important point that whatever solutions they come up with cannot be one-sided in wanting to empower women. It also has to involve and convince the men of the need to empower women.
Actually, you might think that because women have greater power in the household here, we're looking at bilateral and matrilineal societies in Southeast Asia, you might think that, women may not necessarily be left out of the agricultural story, the food security story, but they are. So that's really surprising too, isn't it? I mean, if they are, let's say in Uganda, well, we're not surprised because these are heavily patriarchal societies like Northwest India, for example, compared to South India. South India tends to be more bilateral. You've got exceptions like the Todas and all that. I mean, these are your indigenous sort of tribal groups. Then you've got the matrilineal like Kerala, like the Nayars and all that. So, but here you still have that problem when women are actually powerful in the household. But what's the barrier here, or what's causing the problem is women's reproductive role. So they become invisible as a result of taking on the bulk of the work in the household. So that poses a huge problem for a woman to be connected to the public sphere. And if she doesn't have education and if she doesn't have alternatives in life, that woman is going to be left behind, or the likelihood of her being left behind is much greater than a woman who's educated and gets out into the public sphere. And she's got all these alternatives. I wonder if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess it also comes with like the intersections of like which women have access.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it also takes a real change in mindset that women are just not associated with the home and with caregiving. And as long as that doesn't change, women are going to have problems in every dimension. Are they going to run into obstacles? And there will never be gender parity in all the other dimensions. In fact, this is a point that Shulamit Firestone, feminist Shulamit Firestone, raises. She says it's because women are connected to their reproductive role. They're intimately connected to it. She breastfeeds the child, she carries the child, she breastfeeds the child. And society forces her to keep doing that. And that's what's actually holding her back. But if we could rethink that children are supposed to be raised by communities, like in a kibbutz system in Israel, then you have a totally different mindset. And so women are free of their reproductive role. And that's when she can be truly free. Then she talks about liberation and about empowerment, etc. By the way, she's a feminist from the 1970s, so her ideas still hold. Yeah, she's second wave feminist.
So, any more? Some of the latecomers? But it's
I
good
was
that you
taking my
come.
own singing lessons.
Oh, okay, that is important. That is important. Well, if so, then I think we will conclude this short but still quite engaged conversation. And I think the conclusion is we have to find a way of redistributing the task in the household between men and women. So the reproductive sphere needs to be divided, because I think what is happening is, yes, women are more in the public sphere, but still the ones that are interested with the change, more difficulties within the family, it seems, in many regards. So how to ensure men also sharing the raising of children, etc., etc. So those is the challenge now, I think, ahead, besides changing the vision of policymakers, including development workers, because it takes a lot of time. Those who make the programs are so-called development experts. Yeah, there are a number here in this group. So with this, please enjoy the coffee and tea that is outside, and some fruit, and also give a donation on your way out, because this helps the junction to continue to do more events related to Southeast Asia. And if you want to buy the book, it's also available outside. Thank you for coming, and please continue to follow us. Thank you very much.